Welcome back. As we saw yesterday, the new Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen's performance at the Press Club, pretty extraordinary, as the rest of the world is turning back to reliable baseload power, coal and nuclear in particular. He wants us to head further and further into the energy vulnerable abyss. It's as if he's living in an alternative reality to the rest of us and the rest of the world. Let's bring in someone who can pull all of this apart, business columnist Terry McCrann. Well, Terry, you have often said this renewable obsession to the expense of baseload power that's affordable and reliable is economic suicide. It's an economic suicide note. We look at the world, US, UK, Germany, Japan. I've gone through most of them in recent days, all heading in the opposite direction to what the regulator's saying we should do here. And they want to spend billions and billions of taxpayers' money on the folly. What do you make of AEMO's pronouncements today?
Well, both AEMO's pronouncement, Peter, and, as you say, the speech from the Climate Change and Energy Minister, I just want to take a moment to point that out, that they've made very clear by the order in which they designate the title what their primary objective is. Their primary objective is to embark on climate change posturing, not to provide Australians with reliable, far less cheap energy. And I think the government is saying that right up front, that we don't care about the energy that you actually get. What we care about is grandstanding on that global stage, precisely when, as you say, the whole world is coming back to at least some form of reality. We've lived through an extraordinary 2 days, Peter. First, that speech by Bowen, where he put on his blinkers. He's absolutely refused to see the reality, not only of the world, as you've described it, but the reality of what's been happening in Australia for the last 2 months, when we've had this extraordinary rise in electricity prices, this extraordinary rise in gas prices, and we came very close to actual blackouts and brownouts with electricity, and there are shortages across the board in terms of gas. So you would expect an energy minister, somebody that was actually concerned with delivering on his portfolio, would actually focus on addressing the short-term reality. That short-term reality is a lack of, and it's the unreliability of, both electricity and gas, to say nothing of the ridiculously high and unnecessary prices. Yet we embark on this fantasy about what we think we will do in the next 20 or 30 years. It is the most extraordinary start I've seen to a new government in my lifetime, and I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that.
No, and I think AEMO is responding to government stated policy, which would have been the same if Scott Morrison had been elected, this net zero 2050, and they work back from that, which is why they're saying we've got to spend billions, we've got to, 9 times increase our current levels of renewables. But also buried in those reports detailed today, it's a very long report, 180 odd pages. They've got stuff in there about shutting down coal-fired power stations in Queensland and Victoria as much as 15 years earlier than expected.
Exactly.
Now, how on earth does that make economic sense?
Well, it makes no economic sense. As Greg Sheridan said, if you've got 100 windmills or 1 million windmills, if the wind isn't blowing, you don't get any power. So what is their solution to that? Well, the solution in the first instance is to scatter batteries all over the countryside. I mean, and let's just take a step back, Peter, and think about the basic reality of 9 times what we've already got in terms of those turbines and those solar panels across the Australian landscape. 9 times as many, 900% increase on what's already there. This is an extraordinary assault on the landscape and on the countryside. I mean, the Greens in their earlier manifestation would have said this is a tragic despoliation of the landscape and our natural environment. The $340 billion they say this will cost.
Just on that, it's interesting, isn't it, what 30 or 40 years on from the damming of the Franklin, that big fight in Tasmania. Right. No one wanted hydro. Now we're told in this report too we've got to increase hydro. And in the case of Queensland, we're told we have to increase hydro to the equivalent of 30 times what we've got in the Wivenhoe Dam. Now, we're not building dams either, so where are we going to get this hydro from?
Well, just on both those points, Peter. I mean, the other thing that they say we have to have in this is 10 gigawatts of gas-fired power. Now, that's 5 Hazelwoods or 5 Liddells. I'd be quite happy to state now we are not going to see one new gas-fired power station, far less 5, certainly not given the ridiculous furore they would create, but also given what Chris Bowen said on Wednesday. He said he will not tick off on any new ventures, coal or gas ventures, which compromise the mandate, and that mandate is to actually close them down. So that the reality that we're going to actually get those gas-fired power stations is that it's just one small part of the overall fantasy. But let me just make the point on that cost, $340 billion. Well, you can double that for starters, at least, Peter. I mean, the idea that we'll get away with a cost of only $340 billion, given what happens to government projects and these sorts of projects all the time, the explosion in cost, the explosion in debt, all of which goes on the credit card, the national credit card, and ultimately feeds into the power bills of consumers.
Of course, all at a time where we know we've got to spend more money on defence. We know the NDIS is about to cost us more than defence and hospitals combined. We know that the assault on coal, taking coal out of our resource mix and losing those export dollars, will cost the economy hundreds of billions of dollars. No idea how we're going to replace that sort of revenue. Just quickly on electric cars. A real push from Chris Bowen on electric vehicles, talk that he will mandate the sort of car we're allowed to drive. Now, overseas last night, that was a big push from the European Union. Already Germany, which makes a lot of cars, says we're not going to play ball. We're not going to be a part of this madness. Now, this is Germany, which was green and woke a couple of months ago, but now they've got no Russian gas. They're waking up to reality.
Well, it's outrageous in any context, particularly in Australia. And again, Peter, this takes power out of this grid. It doesn't add power to the grid. And the whole problem is power coming out of the grid.
All right, well, got to leave it there. We will be talking about this again. Terry McCrann, you are a bright light of common sense. Thank you for your time.